In my upcoming book called Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving In, my co-author Dr. Joelle Salinas and I introduced the concept of conflict tolerance. Today, I'm going to unpack what conflict tolerance is and why understanding your own conflict tolerance and how it might be different from others can help you increase your own ability to navigate conflict in your professional and your personal life. Oh, and if you don't already have a copy of my book, you can order one right here by clicking right here. Please do that. Or there's a link in the description below. I'm Bob Bordone. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School. I'm the founder and former director of Harvard Law School's Negotiation and Mediation clinical program. And I'm the founder and principal at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. So let's start with a definition of conflict tolerance. Conflict tolerance is the measure of your ability to be present in the face of disagreement without either losing your cool or avoiding or changing the topic. So I want to break this down a bit more because conflict tolerance actually has two related but different components. The first is what's called conflict recognition, and the second is what's called conflict holding. So I want to take each in turn and describe them to you. Let's start with conflict recognition. This really relates to our own internal barometer, our internal coding for when we experience an interaction as conflict in the first place. Let me give you a few examples to make this real for you. Imagine you get into a disagreement with a friend on political issues. On the range of, oh my gosh, this was an awful relationship-threatening conflict, to, on the other hand, this was a super fun, wicked cool debate. Where would you rate yourself? Let me give you another example. This time it's a work one. You have a disagreement with someone on your team about, let's say, what the advertising strategy should be for the next 6 months. The two of you actually never reach agreement. As a result, your boss chooses neither of your proposed approaches. Does this situation keep you up at night? Or do you just say, hey, it's all in a day's work? Conflict recognition is that internal switch that we all have that drives the border between whether we find ourselves in something that feels like an uncomfortable conflict or something that feels like an ordinary debate or a conversation that occurs all the time in work or family contexts. And here's the insight that I want to share with you. It turns out each of us has a very different conflict recognition threshold. That means what I might experience as a really fun conversation might be extremely threatening to you, or vice versa. So with this knowledge of differences around conflict recognition, how do we handle this? This first piece of advice is just to become more self-aware of your own conflict recognition threshold and how that is in fact different from others. Secondly, if you're in a conversation that you might be thinking is fun or just we have a different view, but you have a sense that for the other person, this is feeling stressful, you want to pause. You might even think about checking in with them. How is this going for you? What are you experiencing? What's going on for you? Is it okay to continue this conversation? You might even just say, hey, I'm going to back off for now. So let me give you an example of how this has been incredibly helpful in my own life and even in the writing of the book where we talk about this. So it turns out I am somebody who has a very high conflict recognition threshold. I think that's partly because I was trained as a lawyer. I think it's partly because I've spent much of my professional life in conflict situations and coaching people to negotiate. And so for me, actually, we can have a fair amount of disagreement before I'm feeling like we're in conflict. But it turns out my co-author, Dr. Salinas, sees it very differently. For him, even very little disagreement can keep him up at night. So what qualifies as a conflict to him, what he recognizes as conflict, and what I recognize as conflict are really different. And so what that meant, even in the writing of our book, is that I had to take a more sensitive and more thoughtful approach whenever I had a disagreement with him. I had to be really clear about what the disagreement did and didn't mean. And I had to be very explicit that the disagreement was not about, for example, his contribution to the book or his ideas. It was more about, like, I think we just are coming at this in different ways. Okay, let's talk about the second component of conflict tolerance, what we term in our book conflict holding. So holding is the ability to withstand or sit in the presence of the conflict once you have classified it as such. So it's different from recognition. So it's how you can kind of sit with the reality that you are in conflict once you have acknowledged it to yourself. So I'm going to use myself as an example here. I have a very high conflict recognition threshold. I think, as I said, it's a dint of my training, maybe my family of origin, etc. So I see all sorts of behaviors around disagreement as normal and healthy and, if I'm being honest, kind of fun. Here's the thing though. Once I recognize something as conflict, my capacity is pretty low. In fact, I move immediately to either problem solve, compromise, fix it, or escape. So why is understanding this distinction important? Well, first of all, when you find yourself particularly in an ongoing and important relationship where you're constantly running into tension with your mate, let's say, or your colleague or your best friend, having the tool of both conflict recognition and conflict holding gives us some vocabulary that allows us to actually have a conversation about where we might not be lining up. Each of us, in fact, has different conflict recognition patterns and different holding thresholds. Let me give you an example from a real situation. Some years ago, I was working with siblings. This is a brother and sister, and they had a whole host of conflicts. But in particular, there was huge breakdown whenever conversation about politics came up. And it turns out that both of them had extremely low conflict holding thresholds. But the brother had a very high conflict recognition pattern, and the sister had a very low one. And so the brother thought talking about politics, talking about Donald Trump, talking about wokeism, that this was just like super fun and like he got all of his energy from it. The sister felt that the entire relationship was at risk. And so just giving them these categories and this language gave them a way to talk about how they could have these conversations in a more amenable way. The second purpose in understanding this distinction is it can help you identify where you need to grow with respect to your conflict tolerance. So for me, it's partially being more sensitive in domains that someone else is experiencing as conflictual and that I'm seeing as fun and games or healthy debate. But it's also learning to increase my own ability to sit with discomfort when I do feel like I'm registering it as conflict. So in the comments sections below, how would you describe your own conflict recognition threshold and your own conflict holding ability? And importantly, what could you do to increase your conflict handling in both of these domains? If you want more coaching on how to handle conflicts in negotiation, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell so you never miss out on the latest for best practices. And for more on how to improve with conflict, be sure to watch this next video, How Can I Be More Comfortable with Conflict? I'm Bob Bordone. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Okay, pre-order now and keep watching. Click, click, click.